Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you enjoyed your lunch, and thank you all again for being here. We're just so excited to have this wonderful crowd and to all benefit together from hearing the wonderful lineup of speakers we've managed to attract. So Stephen is a former lawyer and a current PhD student. His research concerns education's capture by an ideological but evidence-poor critical theory at the expense of cognitive science-informed best practices to effectively, efficiently, and equitably impart children with humanity's most consequential knowledge and skills accumulated to date, necessary for both future innovation and responsible participation in adult society. Are you a Judith Butler fan?
Yeah, not really.
Stephen is a co-chair of University of Toronto's Heterodox Academy and a member of the organization's national executive. Lilach Marom is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University. Her research draws on critical theories to highlight issues of equity, anti-racism, and inclusion in education. She has worked as an educator with diverse students and communities in multiple contexts. She has written about the experiences of racialized, Indigenous, and international students in higher and teacher education. Her current project examines EDI policies, discourses, and action plans in higher education, asking what is included and what is left unaddressed in pursuit of a more robust understanding and implementation of EDI. So with that, I'd like to invite Stephen to the podium.
The classically liberal purpose of the university is the search for truth, which necessitates free thought and inquiry and the ability to question everything. On the other hand, EDI's purpose is social justice. This requires unquestioned allegiance to critical theories' underlying assumptions and no inquiry into the validity of those assumptions. As our founder, Jonathan Haidt, wrote in 2016, these two purposes are at odds with one another and can't be reconciled. So my position that you will hear is that EDI must be retired. EDI is founded on contemporary critical theory, and in particular critical race theory, which has the following non-negotiable presumptions. 1, every idea or creation from Europe, even if it's not exclusively a product of Europe, and even if it was abandoned centuries ago, is whiteness. 2, only whiteness colonizes. No other society or culture does, even if this is historically false. 3, whiteness is a monster. It is the reason for every pain and injury in society. 4, science and the search for truth is an expression of whiteness. Many black thought leaders have argued that this is racist in and of itself. They must be white apologists, because to question any of these 4 points is considered to be white supremacy, white fragility, denialism, if not racism and sexism itself. So what is EDI? Well, let's start with equity. The literature says equity is fair treatment and equal representation. But let's explore whether or not you can actually have both fair treatment and equal representation at the same time. The legal definition in Canada of equality is fair treatment without discrimination, taking into consideration the need to accommodate access on a case-by-case basis. And here the Supreme Court of Canada was thinking about corrective measures for demonstrable handicaps, such as that you need mobility aids or vision aids. But when you treat people fairly, the outcome is uncertain and may not be representative because it depends on merit. And we're going to get to merit in a moment. Equal representation means manufacturing equal outcomes. And you can't do that without rigging the process and making it unfair. In other words, instead of process leading to outcome, in EDI, the outcome has to determine the process. Now, Wimmer argues that EDI resists acknowledging any societal progress in the reform of processes. So where do they turn their anger? They turn their anger and their disgust with the world to outcomes as the basis of discrimination claims. Moreover, social justice isn't interested in equal outcomes for everything, only for the areas, to be frank, in which the average American-born black outcomes are lower than that of their competitor, or their comparator, American whites. Now, obviously, EDI doesn't worry about Jewish or Asian underrepresentation in the NFL. EDI is also uninterested in equal representation of, for example, male faculty in social work or education, the growing lower male participation rates in post-secondary education. It's not interested in boys' underachievement compared to girls in K-12. EDI would never acknowledge the fact that gays and lesbians fare better academically and financially in Canada compared to their heterosexual compatriots. It is therefore intersectional ideology sourced from American narratives that determine who deserves equity, not the facts of the specific situation. So let's move on to diversity. EDI is only interested in the visual representation of diversity, much like the racial taxonomy craze of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, EDI just adds the visuals of a hijab and someone appearing trans, and ta-da, visual diversity is celebrated. As evidenced by box ticking and phrases like, as a non-binary, queer, mad, racialized person, I believe, as if that's supposed to strengthen the argument, the book cover is more important than the book itself. That's why EDI isn't interested in the diversity of opinion, because opinion would be the content. EDI is surface level. Intersectional critical race theory defines diversity along the lines of skin color, sexuality, and now gender identity. But you'll notice that EDI never sets an end goal. How do you know when we've actually accomplished diversity and the job is done? Is representation supposed to be based on the percentage of a city's population, a province's, the countries, the globes? This means quotas, whether you're honest enough to say it or not. Look at the Canada Research Chair Program. It demands that all institutions that accept agency funding make concerted efforts to meet their equity and diversity targets. Yet those targets are never stated. How would this work? Well, let me give you this hypothetical. The Indigenous population in Metro Vancouver was about 1.4% of the total population in 2021. Same for the black population. So you would need 100 people to justify just one black person or one Indigenous person in a faculty or in a company or in employment if you're talking about representational equity. So, in an office with fewer than 100 people, having no black or Indigenous representation is not underrepresentation. You see why EDI doesn't define what diversity is? Diversity is also claimed necessary for successful learning. But that's a myth. It's a myth that academic outcomes are better when you see yourself reflected in your teacher or in your professor or in the materials to be learned. There's actually, and this has been tested, there's no evidence for this. And I'm going to give you a personal example. So here are two exceptional teachers that I've had. The first one was for grade 3. I never saw myself in her. I actually thought that she was 100 years old and lived at school. The second one was for conversational French in third-year university. I never saw myself in him either, but boy, was he a good professor, and I was bilingual by the end of the year with him. In grade 5, we spent most of the year working on Anne of Green Gables. It started my love of reading. Despite not seeing myself in either L.M. Montgomery, we don't look alike, or Anne, I am certainly not a red-headed orphan girl from PEI. I didn't see myself in any of those characters. And then in grade 10, we studied Crime and Punishment, which was a novel that deepened my interest in foreign countries, in Russia in particular. And no, I did not see myself in Dostoevsky, despite the beard. Yeah. But look at me there. At 16, I didn't have this beard. Nor in Raskolnikov, the protagonist. I was not a Russian murderer. Education is there to open windows to other worlds, not to affirm you as the most important thing in the world. And finally, inclusion. Now, this one never gets defined in the literature. It gets synonyms: belonging, safety, safe spaces. Look, you can ask people to be polite and respectful, but you can't force bubble wrapping. The fact is that in a university, Institutional standards such as merit and the ability to pay university fees, that's what actually defines inclusion. You are included when you can afford the fee and you merit acceptance. Critical theorists abhor the idea of merit as the price of admission, and they have very little to say about the entry fee. And that's because they're not interested in leveling the playing field. They're interested in having no playing field at all. Let's move on to systemic barriers. These usually go undefined in the literature as well. And I suspect that that's because they aren't actual barriers built into an actual system, but rather they're factual obstacles to the validity of critical theory itself. So let's examine some of those barriers mentioned in the EDI literature. For example, whiteness, merit, nationalism, and bias. Whiteness. An intersectional critical race theory says the main barrier is said to be the racism of a white majority and its state institutions doing the work for the white majority. So that's assuming that everybody who happens to be in the majority and happens to have low coloration in their skin is naturally a racist. I think that's a racist proposition. This begs a question. Why would a white majority permit other so-called races to surpass them? In Canada, Indians and Chinese are more economically and academically successful than the so-called white race. If so-called white people generally view themselves as superior, then the fact that white Americans are the only social group that has negative attitudes toward itself, but positive attitudes toward everybody else, demands an explanation. Patriotism. EDI is premised on the assumption that nationhood, national character are bad things when they come from the West. But EDI is glowing, just like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, when it comes to all other peoples, especially the fetishized ones, imagined to be natural, in sync with the universe, uncorrupted by Western civilization, or even worse, that they were these forest fairies that were then colonized and subject to deprivation as if these people don't have agency or might not want modern medicine in their lives today. So Canada's bad, Israel's bad, the UK is bad, but Palestine is good. Nigeria is good. Indigenous nation building is good. Critical theories give no consideration to the benefits of having a Western liberal state that bases its advancement in logic, reason, and a rules-based order, like the enforcement of civil rights, institutionalizing conflict resolution, advantages in health. For example, here in that graph, lifespans that since the Industrial Revolution have climbed. Next is the assumption of continuing or worsening bias. Unfortunately for EDI, American studies show ever-declining implicit and explicit bias in society. The claim of ever-present societal bias is simply false. None of the most racist countries in the world are in the West. The West has the least racist countries in the world. Studies have found that bias reduction interventions overall are not effective. At best, evidence for EDI training is inconclusive. At worst, studies have found it to be divisive, counterproductive, unnecessary, and in Richard Bilsko's case, fatal. In studies on EDI training, it has been found that individuals marked from the dominant culture feel that they're not valued in their faculty, in their company. They feel that when engaging with minority groups, they have to be careful. They avoid relationship building because they don't want to be accused of some microaggression. Individuals of Asian heritage also feel targeted and wrongly accused of helping to perpetuate white supremacy. And finally, as part of the white supremacy barrier, let's talk about merit. Merit equals natural talent, social capital, and personal effort. Therefore, the real barriers are not systemic, but individual deficits in any of these areas. Natural talent can't be changed. Bridging social capital can do a lot of good, but only in the early years as an intervention, not at the late stage of showing up at the workplace. And personal effort is your own personal effort. Labeling barriers as systemic without naming the system and naming the discriminatory policy within that system is simply obfuscation to shield EDI from actual academic critique. EDI has nothing new to say to help people overcome one barrier evidence has established as the most cogent: socioeconomic status, family income, proximity to urban areas, family cultural capital. But since SES is not central to critical race theory, EDI pretty much ignores it. EDI might discover that SES and cultural capital as actual barriers if it didn't denigrate multivariate research as too white and too colonial. But since both Lilach and I are in education, let's talk about the decades of experimental research showing how correcting for SES requires transforming elementary schools to equalize the playing field. And it's actually accomplishable through non-progressive educational techniques. One, the provision of pro-academic social capital, a strong core curriculum, adherence to cognitive learning theory. Cognitive learning says we don't rely on children's lived experience. We rely on the teacher's mastery. The teacher is the center of the classroom and has to provide all of the background knowledge to all of the students so that the middle class doesn't get an upper hand, and you don't leave anyone behind. And longitudinal experiments prove its success. But by high school, university, or the job market, it's too late. EDI and critical theory do nothing to better the human condition because of their own ideological commitments like reifying race. And this is a bait and switch. They say race is constructed. Nothing good has come out of believing race is a thing. And the fact is, race is a term that many black people use to define their ethnicity, like Jews or indigenous people might use the term tribe. But other than this use, no one feels attachment to their race except actual racists, like the KKK. So if race is so bad and constructed, let's just get rid of it. Why does EDI designate worthy and unworthy identities? This is frankly dangerous, let alone discriminatory. Universities that demand that you check boxes are forcing the vast majority of people to racialize themselves in an active identity compulsion. And let's not make identity a point of conflict over resources. Let's not invite people to game the system. Identity's theoretical purpose is to name allies and enemies for revolution. And that's why no one cares about the Jews or Asians, because they represent a classically liberal success story. Critical theory is the moral scold of the academy. It has nothing to do with civilizational knowledge, learning, children. Therefore, it has no place in the university. It has no place in departments of education. Philosophy, maybe. Sociology, maybe. So who benefits from EDI? Meet the symbolic capitalist class. The real goal of EDI is to provide them with jobs. The Canadian government has spent over $1 billion on EDI since 2016. And despite EDI advocates terming everything related to capitalism as neoliberalism, EDI is a multi-billion-dollar industry and the very model of neoliberalism itself. The whole purpose of EDI is not to improve classical liberalism, but to dismantle it without a plan for what comes next, except for some undefined utopia previously promoted by Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Kim, and Pol Pot. It's high time that brave academics and university administrators demand a renewed commitment to the foundational telos of the university and approach any issues of inequality or exclusion, if they exist, in a reasoned, truth-seeking manner that respects the university's classically liberal tradition. In short, EDI must go.
All right. Thank you, Stephen, for an always entertaining presentation. Lilach, you're up next.
Thank you, and thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Heterodox Academy, for having me here. And I really, what? Oh.
Yeah, you don't need that. That's in support of Lilach's position.
Yeah, exactly. So I really appreciate the space for having constructive conversations, and so because we are, I have limited time, so I have some notes, but I'm hoping to engage later on in conversation. So I want to start with what has not happened so far in this conference, a land acknowledgement. And good thing that Karen left, so I'm not in trouble. But for those who might not be familiar with this practice, land acknowledgement have become a common in Canadian society, including in higher education. They recognize the history of the land on which we gather today. As with many other things, land acknowledgements have become a site of debate. Are they performative? Are they political indoctrination? This, of course, intersects with today's conversation. So I'll start with the acknowledgement and then share why I do it. I will make a case that acknowledging the land is not about performing wokeness. So I want to acknowledge that this campus, the Harbor Center of Simon Fraser University, is located on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'm an educator, and the land acknowledgement is an invitation to contextualize my work. The land we gather on has a complex history, which is not always told. History, like many other forms of human knowledge, is entangled with perspective. The acknowledgement of the colonial history of this land and its ongoing legacy was until recently not centered in our research and scholarly conversations. This has changed, particularly since the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its calls to action. Here is what matters for this talk. Before land acknowledgement became common practice in Canadian higher education, the academic space was not neutral, universal, or purely objective. Instead, it was presenting a narrow and curated view of history and its legacies. Land acknowledgement did not introduce politics to the university. They revealed that politics, they were already here, under the surface, invisible. Acknowledging the land and the people who have lived and continue to live on it is a sign of more knowledge and more diversity of viewpoints, not less. For me, land acknowledgement is not about forcing a one-dimensional future. Rather, it is about listening to voices that have been missing, which opens the door for more possibilities and greater plurality. This is also the core commitment of EDI. For those who knows me, it's not without irony to see me here as a defender of EDI. For a number of years, and particularly in the last 2 years, I have been critical of some manifestation of current EDI discourses. However, this critique has not diminished my commitment to the core values of equity, diversity, and inclusion. I see my work as located at the center of EDI, pushing from within for critical reflection and revision, not to dismantle, but to expand. In this effort, I continue the tradition of critical theory. So let me unpack each letter and then address some critiques. Equity. Equity is not about demographic headcounts or social engineering. It is about creating a fairer conditions of participation. Classical liberalism, as exemplified by Stephen's position, assumes that in a liberal democracy, everyone has an equal chance to participate in the free market of ideas and advance in society. In contrast, EDI challenged the assumption that liberal democracies have already established the best mechanism to achieve equality, and instead it calls for a deeper examination of how inequality is created and reproduced through structural mechanisms. In the context of higher education, equity asks, what does it mean to remove barrier so that more students can access university? How can more students as well as faculty advance in their professional trajectories? Answering these questions requires to look beyond the individual and study broader patterns. If a person lives in poverty and lacks access to good schooling, their access to university will be harder. This does not mean that the individual cannot overcome such barriers, but the fact that some do is not a proof of a level playing field. Some argue we should focus only on class to avoid identity politics. I agree class needs more attention. It has been marginalized in some EDI iteration. But factors such as race, gender, and class often intersect in creating barriers. As Nancy Fraser argues, for more just institution, we need both redistribution of resources and recognition of identities. For example, there is a substantial research showing that representation of diverse communities and forms of knowledge in the curriculum or having instructors from minoritized groups broaden access and increase success in higher education. When critics ask, how do we know perfect equity had been reached, I think about the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was once asked, when do you know you've reached gender equality in the Supreme Court? She replied, when all 9 justices are women. This provocative response was meant to demonstrate that when all women Supreme Court no longer seems radical, it signalizes an adequate level of equity. After all, until 1967, all the justices were white men, and only in 1981 was the first woman selected. This hegemony was taken for granted for almost 200 years. Equity is a compass, not a prescription, guides us to ask better questions about how to create more open and inclusive institutions. Diversity. Diversity means acknowledging human difference. Difference that comes in many forms. Part of the distinction between Stephen and me is that classical liberalism tends to focus on diversity only at the individual level, whereas EDI operates from a position that recognizing individual differences alone is not enough to address the social character of human diversity. Diversity in EDI does not ignore individuality, but it points out that we are not simply individuals floating in society, succeeding or failing on the sole basis of our talents or merits. The way we originate and remain associated with human collectives, whether by choice or by birth, matter for our chances in life. In the current political moment, we often hear about a binary, diversity of viewpoints celebrated by Heterodox Academy versus diversity of positioning, seen as core to progressive or identitarian movement. I think this is a false binary. When we open institutions to people from diverse positioning, we include more experiences and viewpoints, which lead to asking more questions and generating new knowledge and ideas. There is a strong evidence that when women, people of color, and indigenous people were granted entry to universities, new perspectives emerged. Those new perspectives had previously been invisible because lived experience shape what we notice. A well-known example is Carol Gilligan's challenge to Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development, a theory based only on studying boys. What else is still taken for granted? What don't we know yet because we haven't admitted enough diversity? But diversity cannot happen simply by expanding inclusion through identity categories. We cannot assume similarity or difference based solely on group affiliation. For example, if we want to study hiring practices in academia, we should aggregate data to see whether there are patterns by gender, class, and race. But hiring based only on race or gender does not inherently guarantee diversity of viewpoints. Ultimately, diversity is about acknowledging the intersection, not the conflation, of positioning and perspective. Inclusion. Inclusion is about creating inviting educational spaces. In universities, we want all participants to reach their full potential as individuals. But to achieve this, we need to understand the pattern and the structures of institutions of higher education. For example, the start of the academic year often overlaps with the Jewish high holidays. This can disadvantage Jewish students and faculty. Key course information and major grant deadlines occur at the same time as the most important celebration. A real-life example this year, Shirk deadline was on Rosh Hashanah. It is never an issue for people who celebrate Christmas because there are a built-in, taken for granted break in academic life. Universities always operate but by a default, which makes it easier for most people to fit in without noticing the structures that support them. Inclusion asks us to expand those defaults to enhance fuller participation. You might say it is impossible to include everyone all the time, and that's fair. But it is also worth noticing that those who make this argument are often the ones most seemingly included by default. Asking what is built into the university, what is an add-on, and what is missing help us to challenge what we take for granted. Inclusion is a foundation for excellence because people perform better when they feel recognized and supported. Okay, so now I want to move to some critique. Critics argue that EDI is elitist and bureaucratic. It sometimes is. Universities have long been criticized as ivory towers. It's worth remembering that critical theories have proposed that the ideas of enlightenment and progress are often untangled with Western arrogance, an assumption that certain forms of knowledge and ways of being are most valuable. Elitism and its contestation have a long history in academic discourses. As for bureaucracy, anyone who works at academia knows it is already highly bureaucratic to the point of dysfunction. In both cases, features of modern academia are mischaracterized as unique to EDI. A golden bullet of EDI critique is merit. Here EDI is excused as undermining merit in admission, grading, hiring, and research. But what is merit, we should ask? Much of what we call merit is the accumulation of advantages beyond individual control. Where we were born, our families, health, access to education, safety, and supports. Of course, merit is also about what we do with the card we're dealt. People have agency, but the deck is not stacked evenly. Removing barriers that prevent participation expand merits rather than undermines it. To cultivate the culture of merit in academia, we need to be critical of the narrow metrics of merit that often mask privilege. If we can understand merit more fully, our institution will ultimately achieve more rigor because more people will be able to contribute in meaningful ways. Okay, so stepping now from the defense team, I want to address some of the critique I take to heart. I've been in too many higher education spaces where criticism of EDI are dismissed as conservative attacks, white supremacy, or ignorance. Those things do exist and are on the rise, but dismissing all critique is arrogant and does us a disservice. If we, and I say we, because I position myself inside the circle that supports EDI, have managed to alienate so many people and to seem aloof to others, it's poor response to say they should check their privilege or educate themselves. Critical theories are grounded in reflection. We should practice what we preach. So a quick mapping of problems we need to address. EDI practices can be counterproductive, performative, or exclusionary. Like any other frameworks, they are not immune to biases, misinterpretations, and errors. While EDI can feel good, feeling good is not the same as doing good. We should evaluate the outcomes of EDI policies to see what works and what does not, and some folks do this work. Theoretical framing like EDI are powerful analytical tools. They can guide us in seeking more knowledge and deeper understanding, but they are not blueprints for the future. Understanding racism does not entail only one vision of how to eliminate it. Commitment to EDI cannot make certain topics off limit. We need to engage even when it's painful. Inclusivity is the recognition of those in the room and those who are not in the room, not the promise of intellectual comfort. In Canada, public schools and universities, while imperfect, remain among the few spaces where we can freely engage with difference and see the world through each other's eyes. This is an opportunity and responsibility that we should take seriously. In the end, EDI promises lie in the ongoing effort to widen the scope of belonging in academic spaces and to expand the shared pursuit of knowledge. Thank you.
Let me ask you, one thing that I hear a lot in EDI discourse, and certainly you've mentioned it, is barriers. And I addressed this a little bit in my thing. I'm talking about currently. I'm not talking about 1967, which was, what are we talking, 60 years ago, today, what are the race barriers in higher ed in Canada?
Okay, so I think that, part of the take of critical perspective is really seeing racism not in a sense of seeing white supremacists standing and shouting racial slurs, but it's seeing how spaces were shaped in certain ways that might be more accessible to some people than others. And we talk about the history of Canada, for example, had excluded for many years Indigenous people from coming into universities, racial communities from accessing university, and I think including Jews, yes, definitely including Jews, and actually part of my work, as you know, is trying to make those connections between anti-Semitism and anti-racism. And I think it's actually point to some of the problems in EDI discourses in this, the kind of like the exclusion of, or the disconnect between racism and anti-Semitism. So I think those things still have a legacy. And even if you look at universities and you say, oh, those are liberal institutions, even when you look at universities and you say, oh, those are liberal institutions, you look at the laws, they're not preventing anyone from applying to university. But they can still be that people who get access to universities are, some of them have more access than others based on their race, right?
Okay, so give me, again, like an example, is it the structure of the room that would work for, and plus, like, when we talk about races, who are we talking? Like, are we talking about Black people? Are we talking about Indigenous people? Are we talking about Jews? Like, race is also, it's a social construct. So I'm just wondering, like, is the setup of the university not good for Black people? I always struggle to understand what they mean by that the structure of the university today is not appropriate for Black people. And lots of Black people would disagree. They'd say, well, that's racist to say that. Like, why are we're human beings? Like, give me a chair and someone with something to say and a notepad and I'll learn. So what is it exactly? Can you point to anything that, like, factually, that is a barrier?
Well, I can look at this, I can say, I can look at this room, which is pretty white, right? And I can ask myself, why is it? Is there a sign here that says no Black people are allowed into this room? No. But can a space would be less welcoming in some way? Yes. And it might appear that this is a place of diversity of thought and it's open to everybody, but it still can be exclusive at the same time, right? Because if people feel that they would not be invited here in a way, so I think that the disconnect between the assumption of, oh, but we can all come in and debate, sure, we can, but it doesn't mean that we are going to do it, right? So
but we're still back at outcome. So, and I said in my presentation, for example, like in Metro Vancouver, 1.4% of the population is Black. So actually, this is pretty good representation in this room. We have, I don't know how many people exactly, less than 100. We may actually have an overrepresentation of Black people in this room. So again, like, is it always outcome? Like,
No.
like, what about the interest in what are the other variables that might be holding, if you think that Black people are being held back, it might be something else. And what is it in the structure that's holding people back? Like, what did we do in organizing this conference that is excluding Black people?
Well, I think within, and again, drawing on literature of what actually people say when you ask them, and people who are from racialized communities, so they would say a lot of things. They would say deficit assumption, they would say lack of resources, they would say spaces where they don't see themselves represented, or teachers don't believe in them, or they assume that they lack ability. where they don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum, where they don't study things that relevant to their communities, when there is a disconnect between their ability to be part of the community and part of the academic milieu. So there is a lot of research that actually talk about those things that actually matter.
Although wouldn't you agree with me that most of that research is like autoethnographies where you have 3 black women talking about feeling that there's overbearing whiteness?
I don't think so. I think that there is pretty solid research, and I also think, I'm a qualitative researcher, but I think that there is actually a need for qualitative and quantitative. So when I'm looking at the type of stuff that Azim does, so it really gives you like this really important picture. But then for me, you also need to actually talk to people to see what they say, and even if it includes biases, because we all have biases, it still gives you some understanding. And I think that, by the way, this is the project that I do now, which is with Jewish faculty members, and I've done, my colleague Anya there and some other folks, and so we done 65 interviews with Jewish academics, and I think this gives me pretty good understanding and things that I can say about anti-Semitism, although it is qualitative data.
Right.
So
sure. I mean, you pull out themes, but I guess my question would be, and I'll give you an example. I took a class in my master's program where the professor, who was not black, was talking about how black people are poor and black people, don't have social capital, and black people don't have this and black people don't have that. And there was one black guy in my class, and we had to do a group project, and I approached him and I said, let's get to know each other. Let's do this thing together. Turns out, I said to him, like, how do you feel about this message coming at you? And he said, well, I got to tell you. He goes, I'm terrified. He goes, because my father's a surgeon, my mother's a professor. I grew up in Old Oakville, which is like the richest community in Ontario. And I'm a Christian, and I'm a cop. So, do you know what I mean? Like, one thing critical theory always says is, don't believe the single narrative. But critical theory, that's all it does. Like, there's lots of people out there, and I had on one of my slides, like a whole bunch of, unbelievable black thinkers in the United States who would 100% disagree with you. They would say that there is no, now socioeconomically there might be an issue here, right? But in Canada, like, what is the barrier, whether it's an elementary school, that is not economic, like just on race? Let's just talk race, right? Because that's critical race theory's focus. What is it in the structure of university that puts a barrier up for race? And like, we should be able to name that and then say, now we can take the barrier down, right? I can do that for socioeconomic status. I can say, look, by the time you get to university, it's way too late, right? Let's go back to kindergarten. Kindergarten should take the academics out of it. It should just be about supplying the social capital, behavior, caring about community, making your own lunch, cleaning up after yourself, learning songs, nationalism, all that kind of stuff. Grade 1, you have direct instruction by a teacher in front of the class teaching phonics, memorizing your multiplication tables, whatever. That would actually, whether you come from a home with lots of books or ability to hire tutors or whatever, that will equal the playing field. So do critical theorists have a solution, or is it just to constantly ask questions and be critical?
Okay, well, you said 3 different things.
Okay.
So the first one, I think the example that you gave, and I don't say that it does not exist, I just think it's a bad pedagogy, and it's not about, it's not something that is about, this is the way someone teaches racism, I think it's just a bad way of doing it, and many people are not great, or can be bad teachers, right? So I think if you really want to talk about racism and anti-racism, you should have deep conversation, and you should do it in a way that is definitely not trying to essentialize, not trying to say that is one thing, and not trying to put all black people under, or any other group of people under one umbrella. But it also, I think, we should not be too easy on ourselves, and I think what critical theory try to poke those things in liberal thinking that really say, oh, but we're so great, this is like, enlightenment, progress, liberal democracies, we're just progressing all the time, and say, well, actually, let's look a second at our universities, our disciplines, at our institutions. There are on lands that they were taken. There we have history and policies that definitely grounded.
But again, we're going back to history. I'm talking about in 2025.
But 2025.
Are black people in Canada affected by the fact that the Brits colonized British Columbia?
Well, I think yes, because history is not, when I studied history a long time ago, we studied history as events. It's an event and it goes and that's it, it's done. But not, we know that history is a continuum, right? So things, they're not just disappear. And you can say, oh, well, those are such a stupid ideas, we just should get over them. Well, it doesn't look like the world now is getting over them. So I guess those are pretty profound ideas that still have hold in our minds, in our collective minds. And it doesn't mean that we need to keep on reproducing them. It doesn't mean that we cannot challenge them, but we should also, I think it's pretty, it's too easy to just say, oh, we're not there. Canada is just a perfect country. We have no issues here, right? So I just don't think it is the case, right? And so, the fact that the land acknowledgement that I said before, and this is not because I think that everybody needs to perform land acknowledgement, but this is an unceded land. This is a history, and this history has a legacy, and this legacy is still here.
Right.
What can we do with it? Does it mean that no, we can talk about it, but talking about it does not mean that we now need to pretend that everything is great. It's not.
But don't you see how what you're saying is you're converting education into this mission, right? Like even when I gave the example in my class, this is supposed to be a class about preparing people to understand educational policy, right? And the professor's just like rehashing old stuff about racism, and all the examples are from the United States. Like the assumption is that, I guess, is what you're saying, we're all racist? Like I look at it and I go, I'm not racist at all because I actually don't believe in race, other than it being a term that black people use to describe their ethnicity. But I don't actually believe in races in the same way that I don't believe that applying leeches is going to cure cancer. Like I just, like once you remove that, like can you acknowledge that the fact is that the university today as an institution is not, what structure is racist? Like even the example you gave about the Jewish high holidays, right? Has that impeded Jews from doing well at university? No. Like not at all. And I was of that generation where you couldn't go to your professor and say, well, it's some minor Jewish holiday, I can't write the exam or whatever. They were like, well, if it's Rosh Hashanah, whatever, you can write the exam the day before. But that's it. Like I'll give you hand in your assignment before. It was never an extension. It was never after. I still did well, and so did the rest of the Jews. So I guess my question is that these seem like fake barriers.
Well, I think that kind of like you try to create this binary that you are now speaking from this objective and neutral perspective, no. And I'm not. And I think it's not. You are presenting a worldview. And it's fine. It's called liberalism. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that we need to dismantle it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that I don't...
You don't think you're speaking from a worldview
I do.
As well?
I do.
Yeah.
No. I'm completely transparent about it. And my worldview is coming from critical theories and progressivism, which does not mean that I agree with a lot of stupid things that happens in this name and the name of those ideas, but this is the perspective that actually look and the lineage of some of those, by the way, theories. And if you put Marcuse there as if he's like the bad guy, but those are pretty important social scientists and
sure.
Ones that also made like significant research contribution,
Absolutely.
Bringing quantitative sociology into
Absolutely.
The US.
I do have an issue with it being part of education. Sociology or philosophy, sure.
But well, I think education is social sciences, so this is what you do in social sciences, but you talk about different scholarships, and it might be, again, education can be what we think about school, how school should be designed, what is the role of the teacher, right? So those are not neutral perspectives. It doesn't mean that they are political in a sense that they can be, that we just argue politics, but it just means that we make choices.
Right, but if
Right?
we have
And-
if we have a 20-year longitudinal study that says, compares discovery learning and progressive pedagogy, and it shows progressive pedagogy doesn't help anyone and it's most harmful for low SES students. But having direct instruction with a core curriculum that is chronologically organized is actually good for everybody, and especially good for low SES students because the parents don't have to be part of the education system. I mean, why doesn't critical theory say, well, you know what? In education then, we should be directing most of our focus toward these studies, and this should be our focus. When you and I both know the focus of education faculties is dismantling in critical theory and talking about racism and decolonization now. And I always say, listen, you want to decolonize? You be the first example. Walk the walk. Leave your home.
Yeah, so again, I think that it's not, I would say that it's not, to say that you are critical of something does not mean that, it's not like a linear line, right? You can say I acknowledge something that are wrongs, but it doesn't mean that I can erase, delete, go back. I just want to think openly about to address it.
How about make it better?
And make it, and I think it make it.
All I hear from critical theorists is transformational change, or we're going to imagine, we're going to dream of, this dream
but I
work,
think,
and we're going to dream of a future. Like, actually spell it out so that we can decide whether or not it's good.
But I think that I don't know who are the, what you listen to, but
I read your articles too, and they talk about, transformational change and.
Well, I think in some of my articles, I hope, I don't know what you've read, but I try to also suggest concrete things. But I would say that, I don't think that, I think critical theories and every research, it doesn't matter, research should be critical and should be based on evidence. And then if there is an evidence to say that this type of instruction is better, we should definitely take it to consideration. And I think there is a lot of research that actually says that understanding the positionality of students and connecting with communities and with parents and recognition are very, very important to the success in education. And this is why we need to take them seriously. Now,
Although not to learning. There's no evidence that it
well,
actually
I think
improves
learning, again, I think that we are not floating heads coming to class. We are human beings. And in order to succeed in learning, we are embodied. We're not just the head that coming. Like understanding math is also connecting to feeling that I can succeed in math. And that I see a role model there that is a woman in math. And that I can see myself working in a lab. So those things are not disconnected. Wait, and
Okay.
then I also wait, and then I think faculties of education, and I don't want to dismiss, because I think sometimes people say, oh, all of this critique, it's not true. I don't want to I do think that we need to be critical, we need to be self-reflective. I don't agree with everything that is done in the name of EDI. But I really don't think that our faculty of education is all about indoctrination of whatever schooling goes far and wide and deep. Like students they want to do well on the test, they want to, get their assignment, they want to pass. It's not that everybody there is radical, people running around with radical ideas. I think most of them basically want to get a degree and find a job. And we teach a lot of those things. I teach the teacher education program, and the students learn how to do, lesson plans and how to prepare. And I really think that it's about making them better teachers to teach all of our students in public schools by understanding that they are different. And I think this makes one a better teacher.
I think we're done. I just had one quick little follow-up. How many, because I can tell you at the University of Toronto, how many courses in your faculty deal with cognitive learning science, like where you're actually teaching the teachers, this is what the evidence says about how human beings, and in fact all primates, learn, and like that, as opposed to the fads around discovery learning or critical learning or whatever. Do you have any cognitive science courses in your faculty for teachers?
I cannot tell you beside the courses that I teach.
Okay.
I cannot tell
Well, I
you.
can tell you, University of Toronto has one, and almost no, and it's not a mandatory course. Most people don't take it. But anyway, thank you.
All right. Thank you both for a fascinating discussion.
Okay, so I'm going to be a mic runner. So is there a group that would like to go first with a question? Yes, in the middle there. Oh, we got a microphone. Okay.
Our group was wondering at University of Toronto campus if there's any structures or racism that have contributed to a high amount of anti-Semitism there.
That's a good question. I think, to be honest with you, that the anti-Semitism is not about racism. At University of Toronto, I think that there's also people that would, argue, is it anti-Semitism, is it not anti-Semitism? But I think definitely the feeling of exclusion by Jews since October 7th over the last 2 years at University of Toronto is a function of a critical theory-based, DEI-based agenda where Jews are perceived as white. And because Jews did well in school, and they're not seen as having deficits in terms of economically or whatever, they're just seen as the embodiment of whiteness. Now, I think that there's it sources historical undercurrents that people have heard, right? About, like, I've been told, as soon as you wipe the stains of the Kool-Aid off your face, for giving a defense of Israel, and that harkens back to the blood drinking, anti-Semitic thing. Now, I don't think that person who said that to me is consciously aware of it, but I think that those things, and maybe to your point, that those things sort of exist within society. But I really think that it's a combination. I think people also read the numbers. Like, the Jews are a tiny percentage. The Muslims outnumber us. That's where the future is, not with the Jews. So very few people cared about what was going on with the Jews. And listen, I went to the encampment 3 times wearing 2 different T-shirts. One that said "Spread hummus, not hate," and the other one was I got in Israel at Abu Lafia, which is a famous Arab bakery, that says Jews and Arabs refuse to be enemies, and they wouldn't let me in. So yeah, did I feel it? I certainly did feel it, and I would walk around with my big Magen David, and I'd have like a little trail like ducks of Jews that would follow me, like cowering. Is it okay? Is it okay? But was it institutional policy? No, I think that they didn't want to deal with this, right? Like, they're busy with anti-black racism and decolonization. Like, they didn't need something else on their plate. And especially when when you start dealing with Jews, then you start opening up, the sacred beliefs of critical theory, and things might fall apart. We went actually to speak to the DEI heads at the University of Toronto, my supervisor and I. He's my fellow co-chair, and we also spoke to the provost, and we spoke, about not just that, but in general, some of the things that we felt were against the idea of institutional neutrality and academic freedom. And, they just want to paper it over. So they've got their position. They don't want to risk their livelihood. I understand that to some degree. But I also felt like I don't want to participate in the victim Olympics, which is why I don't want to be part of critical theory. It's never been the Jewish way. It's not a Jewish way of thinking. And if we're going to talk about, a Jewish way of thinking, we are strivers, not just survivors. And that was the lesson of the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust didn't get rid of Jews. It didn't diminish Jews. It made them stronger. So...
you want to say? Should I answer first, or is it? Yeah. So I would say, and for me, and I said at the beginning that in the last 2 years, and for me, October 7 was a big rupture in some of my perspective toward EDI. It's not things that I haven't seen before, but it was, well, this is when I left Twitter, but when I logged on, Twitter on October 7, and I saw some of the things of, this is how post-colonial liberalism and liberation looks like, and this is, it was a stab in the heart, really. And I don't think I fully recovered from it. But I did turn it into really deep examination. And I think part of it is really important in highlighting some of the distortions that I think we need to really look at. And I think, yes, some of them has to do with how we understand privilege, racialization, whiteness, and how categories and positioning of othering are based on many things. They're not a binary, and there can be, and those, oppressed discourses are not binaries, and they can work in multiple ways. So this is definitely one thing that I'm interested at, and I'm interested at also because I really think that maybe unlike you, I think that strengthening the work around anti-Semitism is really in those connection to other forms of oppression and marginalization, and push against this attempt to disconnect, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and find those similarities, and how those are in many ways reflected in each other, and how we really need to not be so quick as speaking on behalf of Jews and who is a Jew and who is not a Jew, and really try to gain deeper understanding. And for me, part of this understanding is, and part of it is also very painful. So I definitely think that there is anti-Semitism. And really my work now is trying to map it. But I think part of being Jewish nowadays also see what is done sometimes in our name. And a very, very painful, very painful. I'm also an Israeli, of like seeing what happened to Zionism. And being able to see it and to take it to heart. And this is, again, this is also historical legacy. And so I don't think that, for me, Zionism is not white supremacy. But I'm also very, very worried of what happened, some of the things that happened in this history, right? So, and I really think that for me, this is an invitation to look deeper into critical analysis, and not kind of like push it away or immediately jump and say, oh, this is anti-Semitism, but really to try to look deep. Yeah.
Okay, another group.
My question is really quick and mostly about terminological clarity request to Stephen, but maybe also Lilach wants to respond. When you say critical theory, what do you mean? Are we, like, I'm probably classically trained sociologist, so Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer, they seem to have been Jewish, at least that's how they self-identify to the best of my knowledge.
And
so
they'd be rolling in their graves.
I have not finished the sentence. It often happens to women in academia, so I'm used to those interruptions. I'm used to those interruptions. Yeah, once more. And also, can you please perhaps define racism? How do you understand racism? Because from your talk especially, Stephen, I got a sense that you understand racism as having something to do with the skin color and pigmentation. Thank you.
Okay. So let me answer your first question first. So I like to use the term contemporary critical theory because I see sort of an evolution from the Frankfurters, who, yes, were Jewish, and before I was making a joke, but I think that they'd be rolling in their graves if they saw how it was being turned on Jews, particularly when they saw themselves as Jews as being akin to the workers that were being excluded from the system. But contemporary critical theory has gone through, it's adopted postmodernism, post-structuralism. When it moved to the States, it adopted, the transference from class to race. And then, from race it branched out to gender and sexuality, and that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about critical theory. So I'm talking about, at its core, it's a belief that the world is composed of oppressors and the oppressed, that we have to understand that majority systems or whatever are generally oppressive. They all have a belief that the answer is socialism. We have to overthrow the sort of the capitalist liberal order to some degree, and that we must give power to, before it was the proletariat, and now it's power to the marginalized, whoever they are. And it's of course never, I always wonder who is it exactly that's living in the margins, but that's when I say critical theory, I say that. Race is very interesting. I don't actually believe in race, other than, as I said, a term that Black people use to talk about their own grouping, their social grouping. And every group has terms for the in-group and the out-group and whatever, and it seems to be that race has been one that's been sort of, that because Black people use it, now we all have to use it. Like, I think that we have enough evidence that using racism to categorize people is such a terrible thing. And, and it's not from forever. Like, long before there was racism, there was ethnocentrism, and most wars and terrible things in the world happened because of conflicts between ethno-religious and ethno-cultural groups. That is a far longer history. But to continue to insist that this is a construct, we just made it up, it's a construct, but somehow it's necessary, I think is a bad way to think. Growing up in Canada in the 1980s, no one talked about race. We talked about ethnicity. And we talked about multiculturalism, and we celebrated the fact that we were a nation that was filled with people from all over the world that we could learn from, that we could eat their food, celebrate their holidays, etc. And I know critical theorists make fun of that because it's not about oppression, and it's not about dismantling anything, it's about celebration. But it was a beautiful thing. And to see multiculturalism then be denigrated into this, I don't know why you're laughing, but to be denigrated into this thing where now it's all about race, and really what it is, because we're human beings, it's a conflict over limited resources. And now we found one way where people, and I'm not even sure that the so-called marginalized people are the ones benefiting from it. I think it's a lot of middle and upper middle class people who are not Black who are benefiting from it, and those who are Black tend to come in Canada from West Africa and get those positions, whatever, and they're coming from upper middle class families where they come from, right? No one's going to, for example, some of the Ontario housing projects outside of Toronto that have very poor Jamaican communities, and they're not recruiting from there, right? They're going to the princely places in Ghana to recruit. So I'm sorry, I don't buy that there's this thing called racism. There's no biological basis for it. I think it's been terribly used in humanity, both for Black people and as a Jewish person as well. That was the basis upon which the Nazis sought to eliminate the Jews. So I think that we should get back to, yes, individualism, but I recognize, that groups and that people have connections to their groups and whatever. But where does it end? Why just Black people? What if you're from Sri Lanka and you're Tamil or you're Muslim or you're something else? I mean, this could go on in a country that has 500 ethnicities. Like, are we going to make our whole education system about every rivalry between every ethnocultural group? Like, where does it end?
So, but
Sure.
I'm from Ottawa, Ontario, right? 1980, I was going to St. Elizabeth's. Me and my sister Luann, my dad's Chinese and I'm West Indian, and we used to run home from school because we'd have people chase us with apples, hit us, right? Ontario, Ottawa is a great place. I do resign what you're saying. It's not really racism, but it's not about that. We don't talk about what if. We're talking about what is. And most of your conversation is what if.
Yeah, and can I just...
Yeah. Go for it.
So, yeah, thank you for that. And so, yeah, I disagree, surprisingly. And so two things I want to say. One, I think that, like Anya pointed out, critical theory is a long lineage, and it's not one thing. But I think one thing that is kind of like weave through these theories is that really you try to look beyond the face value. So the fact that you say that, oh, I'm multicultural, or this is liberal, or this is progress, or whatever, or this is EDI, you need to look and really look for evidence. And that you assume that there are some structures and systems and mechanisms and discourses, and all of them kind of like shape our reality. And this reality is man-made. So you try to look at those things and ask yourself, what really is those system and policies and discourses, what they create? What is the thing that are taken for granted? What are the things that are not seen? And I think this is kind of like a constant take on, right? It's like looking at this room and saying who is here and who is not here and why. And it's kind of like just trying to see beyond what is given on the posters, right? And I think this is also relates to what you say. So I definitely don't think that there is no progress, that I don't think that everything is horrible. I don't think that Western civilization need to be dismantled. But I also think that we need to look at some of this arrogance and the assumption that we do it better, and that the knowledge and smartness and imagination, we all figured it out, and other places are behind or deficient, and I think we do have it very ingrained in some of those assumptions that you share, and I don't buy into those good old days. Like I think some of those good old days, they were like pretty bad things that happened in them. It doesn't mean that everything was bad, but I think that what you experienced as these golden days of Canada, for many people, they're not so great. And we try to make them better in many ways.
So we are running out of time. So unfortunately, because we're finishing up at 3.
You can come talk to me at a break.
Yeah. Yeah. So what? Yeah. Okay, we get one more question from a group, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Okay. Sorry.
This one's for Lilach. I'm sorry if I didn't quite get the name. For 2 years.
Lilach.
For 2 years, I was called Bread, so I understand. The Russians don't do the A right for me. Anyway, the question that we had was about Simon Fraser's Faculty of Education. Specifically, only 11% of elementary school teachers in Canada are male, and you were advocating for the fact that it's very important for people to learn from people who look like them. What program? I couldn't find any programs from your faculty trying to increase male teachers, or any programs for male teachers. Do you have any? And if not, why not? That would probably be the most underrepresented group in teachers in Canada, no?
Well, I don't know if it's the most underrepresentative, but it's definitely underrepresentative at elementary education, and for many reasons. Part of it is the construction of especially elementary education as maternal, caring, and the images that comes with this of femininity, which of course can be harmful both for male and females.
I didn't ask for whys, I asked for your policy prescriptions and what you're doing to solve the problem. Not why the problem might exist. What are you doing to solve the problem?
But the assumption is, we also don't have specific program for female physics teachers. It's not that we do targeted recruitment for.
I can say that actually physics programs and STEM programs do have lots and lots of programs to increase female participation in STEM. If you're going to contend that they don't, that's pretty.
You ask about education. You asked about Faculty of Education, my faculty. So I said in my faculty, we don't have targeted program for any group. When we bring teacher candidates in, I hope we encourage them to choose to teach what they're passionate about, what they like. And I teach now teacher education. I have at least 5 male teacher candidates that want to teach elementary. So I do see it changing. And so yeah, I don't know if the assumption that we do it differently to other groups, I don't think it's correct within my faculty at least.
Okay. Okay, so I think we need to wrap up and go to the break. I'm pretty sure we're just double checking the schedule that was supposed to be going to a break at 3 o'clock, is that right? Yeah. Okay, all right, I'm not going crazy. Okay, so thanks. So round of applause to our speakers.